Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this program today, we'll be discussing the social media war against Israel and how we can fight back with truth and intelligence. And a warm welcome to the program. And today I have two very special guests all the way from Israel. They are Yoseph Haddad, who is an Israeli activist and social media influencer, together with Emily Schrader, who's also a journalist and also social media influencer. So guys, it's an absolute pleasure to have you both on the program. And also not only that, the fact is that you are both come from Israel, and to have Israeli guests on the program is very special after 2 years of not having any Israeli guests on the channel and the station because of COVID. It's great to have you both. Firstly, I'll start off with you, Emily. I've had a look at your biography. It's extremely impressive what you do, and you're an incredible spokeswoman on behalf of Israel. But can you share with us your Jewish background growing up in the United States?
So actually, I come from a mixed background, but I was born in Seattle. My family is from Los Angeles, and I sort of moved around a lot. I lived in many different places because I was a figure skater. So I grew up with sort of a strange childhood, but my activism, my connection with Israel really came out of university, and it came as a result of anti-Israel activity. I saw what was happening on campus. I saw the apartheid week. As you know, there's a lot of hostility to Israel, especially on California campuses, and it's only gotten worse since the time that I was there. And that's when I sort of got involved because I was frustrated by the extremism that I saw. And I was a political science major, so my background was already somewhat political. And when I saw what was happening, I knew I needed to do something. So I started getting involved with a few different organizations and pushing back. So it really came from campus, and then from there to everything I'm doing today.
Excellent. So. And Yosef, warm welcome to the program. Now,
happy to be here.
You've got an interesting background as well, because you're an Israeli Arab. Yeah. You were born in Haifa, and then when you were very little, your family moved to Nazareth. So share with us what it's like growing up as an Israeli Arab in Israel.
So basically, you said two major cities in Israel. Haifa, which is the biggest mixed city in Israel, where you have Jews, Christians, Muslims, and Druze living in that amazing city. And then Nazareth, which is the largest Arab city in Israel. We have Muslims and Christians. And growing up also in Haifa and in Nazareth, because in Haifa, most of my family stayed there, and only my parents moved to Nazareth. So I found myself a lot of the times, finishing school, going back to home, as soon as possible make my homework, otherwise my mom wouldn't let me get out of the room, and then just take the bus, 25 minutes to Haifa, and be with my cousins and my friends. And my friends were Jews, Arabs, Christians, Muslims, Druze, whether they're Jewish secular or Orthodox, from the Ethiopian community, Russian community, it doesn't matter. We were all together. And the reason why we're all together is because we loved to play football. That was our hobby. And growing up as kids playing football, what do you think? We care if our team is have Arabs or Jews in it, or if we pass the ball to an Arab or pass the ball to a Jew? We didn't really care. We just like to enjoy together, enjoy football together. And we grew up starting from playing football together. Then this friendship became more. And then we were visiting each other, eating with each other, going out to drink with each other, and also in the holidays, coming to Christmas, Passover, Eid al-Adha. So what happened is I grew up in a way that I knew the tradition and the culture of my Jewish friends, of my Muslim friends, my Druze friends, and they knew my culture as a Christian Arab as well. So I grew up in a group of people, that literally showed me how the Israeli society should look like. And because of that, I have that vision in the Israeli society, how the Israeli society should look like. And keep in mind, I wasn't naive. I understood that outside of this group, that there is anti-Semitism and there is racism and inequality, but it doesn't mean that it's not possible. Because if we did that, it's possible to do it in a bigger way.
Absolutely. And Emily, can you share with us when you made Aliyah to Israel and what that involved? Because it's a big transition, isn't it, from living in the States to living in Israel?
It's a very different life, a culture shock for sure. I mean, when I made Aliyah to Israel, obviously I'd spent a significant amount of time in Israel. I had visited quite a bit. I was working for a pro-Israel organization, so I was very familiar with the dynamics of how life is in Israel. But of course, it's always more than you expect when you have a huge move like that. But I moved about almost 7 years ago. It'll be 7 years next month.
Wow.
And I moved from Los Angeles, where I was at the time, and what really pushed me to make the final adjustment, because I did my graduate studies in Israel. I lived there for 1.5 years, and then I went back to the United States, and I was sort of unsure about where I wanted to be permanently. What made me decide was actually the operation in 2014. Because I was running this huge digital department for one of the major pro-Israel organizations, and I was working literally 24 hours a day because we were operating in 18 languages and putting out content of everything that's going on in Israel, trying to counter the misinformation that was coming out about Israel and what was happening on the ground. And you know, on social media, the name of the game is really being the first person to get the word out. So it was really important for me to be the people who are setting the narrative, who are setting the tone on social media. And as a result, that means I work 24/7. So I really was working 24/7, didn't sleep at all, had calls with Israeli offices and briefings at 4 in the morning, Los Angeles time. And after that, I was like, I'm done. I'm making Aliyah. I can't do it. It's too much of a time difference. So that was the deciding factor. I'd always been interested and wanted to, but that was what really pushed me in the end.
Excellent. Well done. And Yosef, you served in the IDF, and share with us why you chose to serve in the Israeli army. Because as an Israeli Arab, you have a choice, don't you, whether you want to go into the army or not.
What's the IDF stands for?
Israeli Defense Force.
It's not the JDF. It's not the Jewish Defense Force. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's Israel Defense Force. And when the IDF protects Israel, protects all its citizens, Arabs and Jews. And when Hamas and Hezbollah, the terrorist organizations, launch their rockets, their missiles don't discriminate between Arabs and Jews. And in fact, we saw that. We saw that in the last conflict and battle in Gaza, where Arabs and Jews were killed from Hamas rocket. We saw that during the Second Lebanon War, which I participated in and was badly injured myself. But we saw that Hezbollah missiles killed civilians. Half of the civilians that were killed were Arab Muslims. So when I was in the IDF, I was protecting and serving my society, the Israeli society, both Arabs and Jews. And if I can give you a personal story,
of course,
just before I started my service, I started my service on the 16th of November 2003. Few weeks before that, one of my friends from Nazareth, he calls me and says, Yosef, are you sure that's the right path that you want to go? That's the direction that you want to go and serve in the IDF? I said, I'm 100% sure. This is what I want to do. Few days later, a terrible event happened in Israel, but unfortunately, yeah. But because of that terrible event, if I was 100% sure, it became immediately 1,000,000% sure. Because what happened is on the 4th of October 2003, a female suicide bomber, a Palestinian female suicide bomber, entered the Maxim restaurant in Haifa and blew up that restaurant. Ended up killing 21 civilians, Arabs and Jews. By the way, that restaurant is co-owned by Arabs and Jews. More than that, a few days before that, me and my family were in that restaurant. At that moment, it strikes me, and you understand that terrorism doesn't discriminate between Arabs and Jews. If you're an Israeli, if you're in Israel, you are a target, for those terrorists. And from that point, if I was 100% sure of my choice to serve in the IDF and volunteer, it went up to 1,000,000%.
Incredible. And can you share with us that you didn't just choose to fight for the IDF, you chose the Golani Brigade as one of Israel's elite units. But also, can you share with us the experience you faced against fighting against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon back in that horrible war of 2006?
Let's first of all answer the question why I choose to volunteer in the Golani Brigade. And it's because of two reasons. One,
the best brigade?
One, it is the best brigade in the IDF. Anybody says otherwise has no clue what he's talking about. The second, only crazy people accepted there, and you're gonna get to know me and understand I'm a little bit crazy. So basically, those are the two reasons. As for the fight against Hezbollah, it was also against Hamas as well. I said that I've already said that I was in Lebanon during the Second Lebanon War. I was in Binjbil. The fight was tough. I mean, when you need to fight in order to protect your country and your society, you have to do that, especially when it comes to do it against a terrorist organization. Saying that, I would always say that this is the last thing that we want to do. Because in war, you lose people, you lose innocent lives. I've lost 7 of my friends, 3 of my commanders, 1 of my soldiers, and then myself. I got injured very badly just 4 days before ceasefire. But I can tell you one thing. Despite the casualties and despite the fact that this war was very, very, very hard and terrible at the same time, every battle that we went against any terrorists from the Hezbollah organization, we beat them. We won big time, and some of the times you would see bullets in their back because they run away from the battle. It is important for me to say that because I heard after that war, which I was in, that it may be a tie between Hezbollah and the IDF, maybe Hezbollah even won. People have no clue what they're talking about. And in fact, years after the war, you'd see that Hezbollah is considering every step, whether they're going to launch a missile or not, because of that war. And Hassan Nasrallah himself, the executive chief of Hezbollah, said that if he had known that this is what's going to be, he would have reconsidered opening a war against Israel. So it was very important for me to say that, because I want everybody to understand that the IDF is a strong army, and you don't want to mess with a strong army.
Absolutely. So that's a message to all Israel's enemies out there. And Emily, you set up Social Life Creative, and you've done so many excellent videos that we'll be showing shortly on this program, defending Israel and certainly debunking all the lies and the myths about Israel as well. Can you tell us the extent of the social media war that's being targeted against Israel and the Jewish people?
I think a lot of people don't understand how bad the situation is on social media unless you're actually in it, like myself and Yosef and many other activists. But the situation, it sort of began, I started tracking a lot of Israel stuff a little over 10 years ago on social media. And the bias and criticism of Israel existed, but there were less people on social media, and it wasn't as active, it wasn't used as much for politics at the time. Over time, with every operation that Israel's had, you've seen a massive increase in anti-Israel rhetoric on social media. Now, I've been very concerned, as somebody who researches this, whose job it is, I've been very concerned about how the rhetoric has escalated over time and how the misinformation about Israel, or the fake news on social media about Israel, has been spread like wildfire without any way of checking this information. So I started speaking out about this issue several years ago, before the operation in 2014 between Israel and Gaza. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of people haven't listened. They haven't heeded the warning enough. And we've seen, unfortunately, that the result of that has been a massive increase in not just anti-Israel criticism, but straight up anti-Semitism. And this really came to a peak this last May, when you saw how communities spoke about Israel online, and how that translated to actual anti-Semitic attacks in person, here in the UK, in the United States, all over the world. We saw anti-Semitic attacks. And where does that come from? Where does it start from? It starts from social media. And I know this because in 2015 to 2017, there was the stabbing intifada in Israel, where there was a wave of terrorist attacks, both car rammings and stabbing attacks, targeting Israeli civilians throughout the country. And the primary motivator of these attacks was social media. It was the incitement on social media in Arabic. There was even a hashtag for the campaign. I'm sure Yosef can talk more about it. Social media incitement in Arabic is a huge, huge, huge problem, especially when it comes to Israel. And we see that the consequences are actually deadly. It's not just rhetoric. And this is a serious, serious issue that I don't think social media platforms have taken seriously enough in the past. They are improving. Facebook in particular has improved significantly. Google is actually the best, I would say, of all of them, but there are other platforms like Twitter and TikTok that are just way behind. And it's super dangerous right now because you see so many high school kids who are on TikTok. It's the biggest platform for Gen Z and even younger. And there's so much anti-Semitism, and it's just completely unchecked. It's not being dealt with the way that it should. I mean, only last year or the year and a half ago when I pushed a campaign, Adopt IRA, to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism for the social media platforms, only then did the social media networks ban explicitly Holocaust denial. Prior to that, only Google had banned Holocaust denial. Now we have an issue with enforcement. Google is pretty good about it, and Google also is responsible for YouTube. But Facebook, Twitter in particular, and TikTok have all very much struggled with Holocaust denial. So it's an ongoing battle, but we have to keep showing up.
100%.
And Yosef, what's the extent of this in the Arab world? I mean, being a native Arabic speaker, it must be easier to notify. Do you think there's a disconnect between these massive multi-billion-dollar internet companies and social media companies in English and what they say in Arabic? So are they aware? Are they doing as much to highlight the anti-Semitic rhetoric there is in Arabic as there is in English?
So, first of all, allow me to tell you that I'm also a journalist at I24 News in Arabic, and the reason why I'm there, it's because I bring the side that most of the Arab media don't cover in Israel, especially on the Arab society. We've seen that on the social media, definitely on media, Al Jazeera, as I said. You have even BBC in Arabic, Sky News, all those platforms and media that they cover the news regarding Israel. And I'm watching this and I'm saying, this is not true. They took a story, they twist the facts, and then they present it to you. And I'm in Israel and I'm saying, but that didn't happen. This is not exactly what it should be. This title, this headline is controversial. Why didn't it just say what happened? Just for example, Al Jazeera put, 2 Palestinians were killed. Israeli IDF soldier killed as well. But nobody talked about the fact that 2 Palestinian terrorists were killed because they attacked IDF soldiers. So I couldn't really bear that. Now, add to that the fact that nobody really speaks about the Arab society in Israel. Nobody speaks about what's going on, about the reality of our community, about how we are integrated in the Israeli society. I can give you information about our society that will probably shock you. For instance, how many do you think, how many of viewers, audience in the world even, knows that, despite the stigma that Jews control money and control the banks, how many of the people know that the head of the biggest bank in Israel, it's Bank Leumi, the head of that bank is Samir Hajjahia, an Arab Muslim from the town of Taibeh? How many of the people know that Salim Jubran, an Arab Supreme Court judge, sent to prison a Jewish prime minister and a Jewish president? How many of the people know that in the last round of new doctors, despite the fact that we are 20% of the population in Israel, 50% of the new doctors were Arab Israelis? How many people know that there is parliament member in Israel speaking against Israel because they have the freedom of speech? So there's a lot of information that you can see online that it's not presented, or it's twisted and then it's presented. This is why I decided to go there, to go in that jungle and to bring that side, which I'm doing in what I call it behind the scene of the Arab society in Israel. And for the first episode, by the way, what I decided to do is actually go and join an Arab IDF soldiers. It was amazing. saying an IDF, when you hear the IDF, you immediately think, okay, Jews, you immediately think of, I don't know, but then you would see soldiers in IDF uniforms speaking Arabic. It's blood-minding. I mean, people don't understand that, don't realize that. So this is why it was so important to do it, because to fight those, lies on the social media. And I'm happy to tell you that a lot of Arab people in the Arab world are more and more, following and want to know more about it. So there is success in that.
Excellent, that's encouraging. So let's have a look at one of these great videos. This one's entitled "The Truth About Israel and Ethnic Cleansing."
The Yale University student government just passed a resolution claiming that Israel is committing ethnic cleansing and genocide.
But from 1967 until today, the population of Jerusalem has gone from 26% Arab to 38% Arab.
In 1948, there were 150,000 Arab citizens in Israel. Today, there are more than 1.9 million Israeli Arabs, including me.
The total Palestinian population, Gaza and the West Bank, has increased 9 times since 1948. In Gaza, the population has gone from 60,000 in 1948 to over 2 million today.
Since Israel's first major operation in Gaza in 2008, the population has increased from 1.4 million to 2.1 million.
In fact, according to the Palestinian government, there has never been a decrease in Palestinian population in any Palestinian city for as long as they provide statistics.
Does any of that sound like ethnic cleansing or genocide to you?
For comparison's sake, the Jewish population in Europe in 1933 was about 9.5 million. In 1950, it was 3.5 million.
Now that's genocide.
The same week that Yale did this, a rabbi was stabbed on the streets of New England.
Coincidence?
Not at all. It's irresponsible to make exaggerated smears against Israel, especially when these are being used to excuse anti-Semitic violence.
Yale is supposed to be one of the top universities in the world.
Yet apparently, their students aren't smart enough to know the definition of ethnic cleansing and genocide.
And I thought Yale is hard to get into.
And that's one of the best videos I've ever seen in countering the lies that Israel is ethnically cleansing the Palestinians. Brilliant video. Well done, guys.
Thank you very much.
And Nebali, when we talked about the conflict last May, which was absolutely awful, in terms of Israel being fired upon by Hamas, and we have to understand that Hamas is a genocidal Islamist terrorist organization that seeks Israel's destruction, fired over 4,000 rockets and missiles into Israel, paralyzing 2/3 of the country, meaning that ordinary Israelis can't go to school, they can't go to work. Many of them are living so close to the bomb shelters in case one of these rockets or missiles land on them. And then we saw the kind of very measured Israeli response to that conflict by only targeting the Hamas infrastructure, reducing the amount of civilian deaths caught up in that crisis. I think more Palestinians died as the result of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad missing their targets and landing their missiles into Gaza than Israel's military response. And yet Israel's hated, they're condemned. So much of the mainstream media just think that Israel just wants to attack the Palestinians and attack Gaza just for the sake of doing it without putting the whole conflict in context. And then we have all these kind of big social media followers and particularly celebrities using their social media to attack Israel. Why has it become such a big thing for so many celebrities to jump on the Palestinian bandwagon without looking into context of what's going on and realize they're actually supporting a genocidal terrorist organization?
Well, I think that, again, my answer is in short, is going to be social media. There's a lot of misinformation and a lot that gets repeated over time. And people don't really have the attention span anymore to really delve into the issue that's nuanced and complex. And this happens in the media, of course, but social media has intensified it and made it worse. Our attention spans are increasingly shrinking. And so as a result, you have not only celebrities, not only everyday individuals, also elected officials. You know, we saw members of the US Congress using the House floor to accuse Israel of ethnic cleansing and apartheid, which, as we just watched in the video, is absolutely outrageous. There is no factual basis whatsoever for these accusations, and yet they keep getting repeated. So unless you have the motivation to begin with to look into the issue and actually examine the facts, that's what you will go to as a default. Now, when it comes to celebrities, there's an interesting phenomenon because there is a cultural push to be very woke and to be social justice oriented, and inherently that's not a bad thing. But when it keeps you from actually getting the facts of an issue and latching on to things before knowing what's really going on something that's very complex, that's not an American issue, it can bring up problems. And we see that in every operation. A few celebrities will be tweeting Free Palestine, and some of them even after the fact are like, oh, whoa, I didn't know what I was getting into with this. And they're right. There's a lot of activity on social media related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that's just a lot more than they really expect. They think like it's an easy cause that they can throw their weight behind and say, oh yeah, Free Palestine, without actually understanding what that means. And the thing is that when you have people who continue to do that, it actually has intensified over time and become a normalization of hate speech and violence, so much so that instead of just saying Free Palestine, which is what it was maybe 10 years ago when I was in university, now it's become normal to say things like globalize the intifada. So you have people who are normalizing an intifada, which is a violent uprising which targeted Israeli civilians, where hundreds of people died. So we saw this in the streets of New York just a few months ago, and this is the result. Because it's easy. It doesn't cost you anything to say Free Palestine. But when you support Israel, you're demonized and you're attacked by the people online, in particular, who are obsessed with Israel. And I do think that there's an anti-Semitic element behind this, absolutely.
Excellent. Should we have a look at one of your excellent videos explaining this? So let's have a look at Emily in action and explaining why so many celebrities support the Palestinian cause, may I say, naively.
Why do celebrities side with Palestine? Emma Watson, Susan Sarandon, Dua Lipa, Viola Davis. There's no shortage of celebrities who have publicly sided with the Palestinians and against Israel. Now, you'd think it's because Palestinians must be really suffering under Israel. But here's the truth. Celebrities side with Israel because it's low risk and high reward. After all, everybody's heard of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but Armenia and Azerbaijan, not so much. Never mind the fact that the casualties of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are less than the current conflicts in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, Darfur, Afghanistan, the Mexican drug war, and literally every conflict going on right now. Condemning Israel also requires no understanding of what's actually going on here in order to look woke. Israel is disproportionately demonized in the international press and portrayed as the aggressor, despite the fact that the truth is the opposite. So any celebrity who talks about Israel doesn't pay a price for their comments, even if the claims are completely baseless. Like claiming that Israel commits genocide, even though the Palestinian population in literally every single city has increased by year since 1948. Or with accusations of apartheid, even though Israeli Arabs serve in the Israeli parliament, the Supreme Court, the military, and at the highest levels of every single field. Even when the Jewish community is offended, they don't go around firebombing businesses and attacking people who criticize Israel. They also don't organize mass campaigns to cancel people because they disagree with them. After all, there's only 15 million Jews in the world. The truth is, celebrities have more to lose by siding with Israel. Countless artists have been targeted with harassment campaigns just for playing a concert in Israel. They've been threatened, bullied, and demonized for even saying that both sides deserve peace. So we can't be surprised when celebrities latch on to a cynical PR stunt in order to advance themselves. We can, however, keep calling them out on it and educate. Do your part. Share this video.
Is Israel attacking Palestinian civil society?
Israel just designated 6 leading Palestinian NGOs as fronts for the terrorist organization PFLP.
And the US, EU, UN, and many human rights groups are furious.
But they really shouldn't be, given what's already known about these groups. Adamir's co-founder is a PFLP terrorist. Their former accountant, Samir Arbed, is responsible for the murder of a 16-year-old Israeli. Their board member, Yaqub Odeh, is a convicted murderer. And their former director general, Khalida Jawar, is a leader of the PFLP in the West Bank.
Al-Haq director, Shawan Jabarin, was convicted for terrorist recruitment to the PFLP, serving time in prison for it. Jabarin also sits on the board of DCIP, the third organization, which has multiple convicted PFLP terrorists on their board.
UAWC employs Samir Abed, who is responsible for the death of Rina Schnurb, as we mentioned before. They also employ Razak Faraj, who was involved in the same attack. This organization also forged documents to get millions in European funding for terrorist activities.
PFLP terrorist Aturaf al-Rimawi belongs to the Bisan Research Center,
which reports directly to the PFLP and has even laundered money for them. Their offices also double as PFLP meeting sites unrelated to the organization's mission.
How convenient.
And finally, the UPWC is known even by USAID as the official women's organization of the PFLP.
They too forged documents and laundered money for the PFLP.
But that shouldn't be a surprise to the EU, since they've worried about misuse of aid for years already.
Somehow their outrage isn't very convincing.
Finally, accusations that Israel is suppressing critical voices makes no sense when we have organizations operating freely like
B'Tselem, Breaking the Silence, and even Human Rights Watch.
Not to mention dozens of Palestinian NGOs that work against the state of Israel without funding terrorism.
Maybe instead of condemning Israel, the EU should be thanking Israel for exposing where their funds are actually going.
Bit more of a taster of some of the excellent videos both Emily and Yosef are actually producing. Yosef, I want to discuss one issue that we very rarely hear. We always hear Israel being accused of being an apartheid state. We hear Israel accused of ethnically cleansing the Palestinians or stealing Palestinian lands, but we never hear about the horrendous human rights abuses that are happening within the Palestinian Authority. And anyone that's critical of Mahmoud Abbas's regime probably never gets to send another post, or they're just suddenly removed. And the situation is a million times worse in Gaza under the control of Hamas. So why are we seeing what's happening in terms of human rights in the Palestinian Authority in Gaza not being mentioned on social media or pretty much in our mainstream media when there's a massive, massive problem that needs to be addressed here?
Well, let's talk first of all about the definition of apartheid, and especially, considering Israel being an apartheid state. So after the Amnesty report, Amnesty International report, 280 pages, declaring that Israel is an apartheid state, so I woke up as an Arab Israeli, suddenly find myself, according to that report, that I'm a Palestinian. I woke up as a free citizen into an apartheid regime. And I asked myself, but they didn't ask me, or they didn't ask any of the Arab Israeli who live in Israel if they feel that they are under apartheid regime. Because if they would have asked us, we know the reality and the truth. And it's very far away from being an apartheid state. Again, there is problem in Israel. There is racism and discrimination, but it doesn't mean that it's an apartheid state. By the way, you have racism and discrimination also in the UK. You have it in the USA. And I don't see them going and targeting all those countries. A simple fact, we've already talked about how the Israeli Arab society are integrated in Israel. We've already talked about addressing the accusing of Israel doing genocide and ethnic cleansing. We've seen that on the video of how it's an absurd claim when the facts shows differently. And you're absolutely right. People keep forgetting about the abusive, corrupted Palestinian Authority, and not to talk about the terrorist organization Hamas. So I have a name for you, Nizar Banat. Nobody heard about this person. Nizar Banat is a journalist and a political activist from the West Bank, Palestinian. And because he spoke against the Palestinian Authority, he's no longer with us. He was in prison, and immediately after that, he was killed. He was killed by the Palestinian Authority. Now, shift to Gaza, we are dealing with a terrorist organization. Terrorist organization that has no problem to launch 4,500 rockets into innocent civilians. So do you think that they care if a Palestinian in Gaza want to speak out against them? Do you think that they would care, they would hear them? Anyone who would do that immediately will be either in a good scenario, he'll be present. In the bad scenario, he would be killed. Why people are not talking about it? This is a very good question. But this is why we're here, to talk about it. Because if others are biased against Israel and focusing on Israel and what's going on in Israel, but forgetting what's going on in the West Bank and in Gaza, we need to do it. And by being here in this program, speaking here with you about it, to the viewers, to the audience, this is exactly why we're doing it. And I want everyone to remember that name, Nizar Banat. Should I repeat it again? Nizar Banat. I want you guys to know this name, look at it, search for it, because then you would understand what is the problem with the human rights in Palestine, in the West Bank and in Gaza.
And why don't these so-called celebrities not actually realise this and realise that by actually supporting the Palestinian cause, they're actually supporting a cause for genocide? Because we know that, for example, the countless times the Israeli government have offered the PLO and the Palestinian Authority their own state. It's been constantly rejected. Israel pulled out of Gaza back in 2005. There are no Jewish settlements. There are no Jewish presence in Gaza. And yet the world seems they find it very difficult to comprehend this. And why, particularly on social media, is it so difficult to get the message out about the horrendous human rights abuses being committed by the Palestinian Authority against their own people and the persecution and murder of Christians and other minorities in Gaza?
Well, I think that there's a few different factors going on when it comes to social media. The first thing is that there are a lot of organized efforts by groups like the BDS movement who are using, and also Iran, state actors, who are using social media for sinister purposes. We know this 100% for sure. However, we usually find out after the fact. So we know, for example, that Billie Eilish, she had a video, I think it was even an ad on her story about her album being released in Israel. And the response was tens of thousands of comments on Twitter and Instagram and all these social media platforms saying, "Free Palestine, how could you be supporting Israel? They're oppressing Palestinians, they're oppressing Palestinians," without any facts, without any sources. And the response was like, I think something like 50,000 comments on Instagram alone. And basically she got canceled on social media for this. And then it turned out a few weeks later that this was actually from bots. The majority of these comments were from bots. So we do know that this is a tactic that they're using to overwhelm, in particular, celebrities or people of influence who speak out about Israel, even if it's not pro-Israel. In the video, I mentioned that celebrities get attacked when they say they even want peace. Kim Kardashian, she tweeted something during the last operation, not even in favor of Israel, but she tweeted something saying that she believes that both sides deserve to live in peace. People got mad about this on the anti-Israel side. And what's interesting is that you don't see pro-Israel activists get upset when someone says Palestinians should live in peace, but you see Palestinian activists getting upset about this. And you're exactly right when you say that it isn't actually pro-Palestinian to be aligned with some of these groups like the BDS movement. There's nothing pro-Israel about that. BDS disproportionately harms Palestinians. And everybody knows this. That's been the result whenever BDS has actually been successful. Palestinians are disproportionately harmed by this movement. But they don't care about that. They care about demonizing Israel.
And Emily, can you explain to our viewers what bots are? Because, you know, we also have a kind of older generation as well. Even I myself are beginning to learn what these things are. So explain to our viewers what they are, because this is a very important mechanism used within social media to manipulate an outcome.
Sure. So you can create a fake profile or a fake account automated, like through a computer system, in order to create hundreds or thousands of accounts that leave comments based on certain triggers or keywords. So they see when someone, like for Billie Eilish's post, for example, when they see that she posted about Israel, they can even randomize the comments so that it doesn't get flagged as spam by the platforms, and then they will leave 10,000 comments from this automated system that aren't actually people. It's completely fake, but it appears as if it's coming from 10,000 people, and wow, there's this tremendous pushback. But the reality is that it's one or maybe two actors, maybe a handful, or in some cases, Iran, state actors. We know that they've used this tactic quite a bit.
And how is this a new form of warfare? We've been pretty much know about the terrorism wars that Israel face, and then of course the diplomatic wars that Israel has to endure through the United Nations, and then the BDS, the boycott, divestments and sanctions. There's also the kind of media wars, what I'm doing here, fighting and get the truth out regarding television and media, but also the social media war. So how is this war different from any other war that Israel has faced?
Well, first of all, we need to understand that this war, it's happening, and it's crucial that we understand that we cannot neglect that war and that area of social media, simply because it is affecting people and young generation, which some of them will end up in high position in their country, and then they can affect on what's going on regarding the conflict, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So the first step is to realize that it is happening and it is serious, and we need to take it seriously, and we need to do something about it. So for anyone who really wants to fight for the right cause and to speak out the truth, needs to join and do something about it. Now, you don't have to be an influencer with hundreds of thousands of followers. You as a single person can actually take an action that could change people's mind if you do it in the right time and with the right sentence and approach. I'll give you for example, one of my friends, not a social media guy, okay? Barely has 5 followers, but he immediately saw, this is in Arabic, he immediately saw Al Jazeera posted something completely false about Israel. But he saw it the exact time it posted, he saw that. He was the first one to comment. Again, keep in mind, 5 followers, no more. But he commented first. And he commented from his heart and speaking the truth and showing the facts and showing and telling the truth. Because of that, his comment got more engagement and likes and shares than the post itself from Al Jazeera. This is a huge win. And this is how you win that fight. Now, we don't have, to be smart to understand that in terms of numbers, we have no match. You have tens of millions of anti-Israeli activists. I mean, just the Malaysians themselves, there are millions, and Emily can elaborate more on that because she was a target of Malaysian anti-Israeli activists. And we are few. But if we stop, being, saying like, oh, we will deal with it, it will be fine, it will be fine. No, it's not. We have to have everyone who can, join this fight. We need you guys. So it is important to go in that field and fight the fight for the right cause.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to add on to that a lot of times, one of the questions I get in lectures and when I speak to different groups, people they feel like social media is just like a mess of people screaming at each other. And in one sense it is. But you're not usually trying to convince the person you're actually responding to. It's about who else is going to see it. It's about visibility. And even more than that, it actually does make a difference. Because if we don't ever show up to correct the misinformation, and if we aren't ever calling out media on social media, for example, the starting point of the conversation is only going to get more extreme. Mm-hmm. And then we are going to be dealing with an even more severe form of anti-Semitism, which unfortunately is what has happened. So that's why it's so important that we continue to engage, even if it feels like it's doing nothing, even if it's like a like or a comment or something small. It actually can make a difference because all of these small actions make a difference over time and in the greater sum.
100%.
Absolutely. And Emily, we're down to the last 10 minutes of the program or so, but how much is the Abraham Accords a game changer when it comes to kind of social media? Because we have the celebrities, we have all the anti-Israel groups that are condemning Israel. Israel's an apartheid state and all this lies and misinformation. And yet the reality is the Arab world now is not only making peace with Israel, but is also starting a process of normalization that we haven't seen ever in the Middle East, ever since Israel was re-established as a state in the Middle East in 14th of May 1948. So share with us your recent trip to Dubai and how things are changing in the Middle East?
Well, I think that's a great question, first of all, because I've seen over the years how hostile social media is in Arabic when it comes to the issue of Israel and Jews. And there really has been a shift with the countries in the Abraham Accords from person to person, but also online, in the way that they talk about Israel and their understanding of what's happening. And we're really going into a different era, which is a really powerful thing because it also kind of reflects what's going on in Israeli Arab society. So Yosef's organization, Together Vouch for Each Other, we're actually launching in the United States, and part of the reason and the motivation for this is that we're starting to see an increased number of Israeli Arabs who want to be integrated, who want to be a part of Israel. The Arab world as a whole, including the Israeli Arab society, is changing and becoming more and more a part of Israel and becoming more and more supportive of Israel. So we're really entering a new era, and I think that the Abraham Accords, and Yosef will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the Abraham Accords has had a huge part to play in the changing attitudes of the younger generation in Israel and abroad when it comes to dealing with Israel.
Definitely, I couldn't agree more, by the way. But to even add on that, it's not just ended up in the social media. You can see it literally on the ground. That this is huge, because those peace agreements are not peace agreements between governments. They're actually peace agreements between people. And that's why it reflects to the social media as well, because suddenly you see Emiratis are defending Israel against anti-Israeli activists on social media. And then you'd say, wow, this is great, this is amazing. And what happened is, it's sort of like a step after step, because then it's going to, like, from stop the denial of the Holocaust, doing more programs between Jews and Arabs, and Arabs from Israel, Jews from Israel, with Arabs from the Gulf countries. So this is huge. This is an amazing accomplishment. And I'm telling you that the Abraham Accords is just, those countries are just the beginning. There's countries to follow soon.
No, it's absolutely fascinating to actually watch that. Yosef, I'm going to allow you to introduce your own video clip, because this is one that will be of great interest to our viewers. It's called No, Jesus Was Not a Palestinian. So do you want to introduce it?
Go ahead, let's watch the video.
After every Christian holiday, anti-Israel activists spread lies about how Jesus was a Palestinian.
All right, Jesus is Palestinian. I'm going to tell you why.
Apparently, facts are difficult to accept when you're obsessed with hating Israel.
So today, Emily and I are going to put this debate to rest.
And he was also a Palestinian because he lived natively in a land that was called Palestine.
I'm an Israeli, an Arab, and a Christian. And unlike Amir, who was born in Jordan, I'm actually from Nazareth. Maybe you got your education from your mother's side, but Jesus was most definitely never a Palestinian, and you should know better.
The #1 reason for this is that Palestinians didn't exist in the time of Jesus.
Jesus looked a lot more like this guy than he did like this guy.
Really? Because Jesus was a Jew, not an Arab.
And even in the Bible it says, إلى خاصته جاء وخاصته لم تقبله. ولك يا حمار. To what people is it referring to?
But this land was also called Palestine many centuries before Jesus' arrival. It's named after the Philistines.
Philistines are not and have never been Palestinians. Palestinians, Arab. Philistines, Greek. In fact, Arabs only came here in the 7th century after Judaism and Christianity. Like the Ottomans, the British, and many others, the Arabs actually came here as colonizers.
They stole our land. They're stealing our land. It's pretty much been that way for 72 years. They kicked us out, they stole our land, and they won't let us come back.
They stole our land. They're stealing our land. They stole our land. They're stealing our land.
Dude, Habibi, Sharafak. Thousands of Arabs who lived here became citizens of Israel in 1948, including my family. In the War of Independence, some were expelled, many stayed, and many chose to leave, like the one you mentioned.
Muhammad Hadid.
Amir, Amur, Amamir. Well, like that's something you can learn by reading books. Maybe you should focus on the inequality in your country before obsessing over ours. Ours, not yours.
In Palestine, Christianity and Islam are both native. They literally grew up on the same street.
If you actually care about Christians, maybe you should focus more on Hamas, who's ethnically cleansed the Christian population in Gaza.
Unlike here in Israel, where we have freedom of religion. Oh, and in Bethlehem, under the Israeli control, Christians were 80%. And under the Palestinian control, now they're only 20%. وقت فهمت؟ Timid?
I want everyone to know that on Christmas, Easter, and every Sunday, when you are celebrating the life of that anti-occupation, freedom-fighting, charismatic overachiever, you are celebrating the life of a Palestinian.
But you don't actually care about Christians or Jesus.
You're just trying to use my religion to advance your political agenda. Ya khabith.
So can I please encourage you, if you're on social media, to watch and share those excellent videos produced by Emily and Yosef. They're superb. Emily, what programs have you got organised to really kind of challenge the kind of Palestinian narrative? And I mean, you two are an incredible example of peace and reconciliation between Jews and Arabs anyway, because you're going to get married soon. So mazel tov and congratulations. But can you share with our viewers the initiatives that you've got coming up, just to break down some of the preconceived ideas that people have about Israel?
Sure. So we have a lot. We're very busy. We have a lot of programs. We actually just launched a new series ourselves online, Headlines with the Haddads. I'm soon to be Haddad, so that counts. Where we're breaking down the Middle East issues to American audiences. That's our target. And explaining more about what's going on in detail and trying to add a bit of nuance to the situation. Of course, we're also creating our videos. And then I think one of the most important initiatives that we're working on is the organization Together Vouch for Each Other, working to bridge gaps between Arabs and Jews in Israel, but also to defend Israel as Arab minorities abroad. This is an Israeli Arab-led organization, which makes it very unique in this capacity. And we're working on a number of different delegations to bring Israeli Arabs to other countries to speak about Israel. And I think one of the most important initiatives that the organization has been put forward since before I was even a part of it is Holocaust education in the Arab world. I think there's a huge gap in knowledge about Holocaust education and why it matters for today, for preventing future genocides, whether it be against the Jewish people or against anyone else. And Together Vouch for Each Other, thanks to Yosef, has done tremendous work to educate within the Israeli Arab community, but also abroad. I mean, the first event that we held was actually in person, was actually in Dubai. So it plays right into the Abraham Accords.
It was the first time. It's the first time in an Arab country to do a Holocaust memorial ceremony. So it was hysterical. And for us, it was huge, because you would see Emiratis, Bahrainim, from Saudi Arabia as well, lighting 6 candles for the memory of the 6 million Jews who were killed, and to also send a message, never again, in Dubai, in the UAE. This is huge. And in fact, 2 months from now, we are going to be the largest delegation from the Arab-Israeli Society to go and visit Auschwitz in Poland.
Incredible. And
we're going to do a ceremony in Auschwitz in Arabic. It's going to be huge, and this is something that we're really working on. And in fact, the organization itself works a couple of programs. The educational Holocaust in the Arab world, as well as Emily mentioned, the delegation around the world, because we want to spread the truth about Israel from the point of view of an Arab-Israeli organization. Christians, Muslims, Jews, and actually the whole tapestry of the Israeli society. But we never forget also that we need to work inside Israel to bridge gaps between Jews and Arabs, to work and fight against racism and anti-Semitism. And that's what we do as well when we launch programs to make sure that younger future leadership from both societies, the Arab and the Jewish, go up together to have a united Israeli society. And this is what we're looking for. We're looking forward for a united Israeli society.
And Emily, within 30 seconds, how can our viewers follow you both on social media and particularly watch your brilliant YouTube videos?
So, of course, you can follow our show, Headlines with the Haddads, on Instagram, Haddad Headlines on Twitter, and then myself, I'm on Instagram, I'm Emily in Tel Aviv. However, on Twitter, I'm Emily K. Schrader. So that's the best way to...
And YouTube?
YouTube, Headlines with the Haddads. Yeah.
There you go. Very cool. So I want to thank you so much for not only coming from Israel to kind of share the incredible work that you're both doing, but to actually then give a different narrative and a different perspective, and it's so refreshing. So thank you so much for coming all the way from Israel onto the Middle East Sports. A pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And I want to thank you for watching this program today. I think it's so imperative that we have a different narrative, that we have a perspective from the Israeli Arab perspective when it comes to Israel, because this is one we're not used to. It also then shows what it's like to be an Israeli Arab living in Israel. There is no apartheid, there is no genocide, and yet we see that Jews and Arabs are living peacefully together, and that is the truth. So I want to thank you for watching this week's edition of the Middle East Report.